Yes, let's do so. Let's do so.
Yes.
So everyone, I just want to thank everyone for being here. I want to thank Professor Asger Sørensen. Did I say it right?
Yes, that's actually very close to how we would pronounce it.
I don't know how to do the Sørensen.
Oh, but it's quite good.
Thank you very much. Professor Asger is from the University of Aarhus, right? He is an associate professor of philosophy of education at the University of Aarhus, and his research interests include academic freedom, alienation, formation, citizenship, education, democracy, justice, and peace. He has lectured worldwide, from Europe to Latin America and China, and he has served as a spokesman of the Nordic Summer University, and he is now the president of the Danish Philosophical Society. So it's a pleasure for us to have you here with us today at our Talk on Alienation special session. So Professor Asger, you have the word. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Umberto, for inviting me. And thank you very much for someone who couldn't be here today, Dirk Michel Sjerkes, who's my colleague at the University of Aarhus School of Education. So, I mean, I'm really grateful to be here, and I mean, to be in a continued session on alienation when I work on alienation is a great privilege. So, I mean, I really hope to benefit from your comments, and I have already, I think, benefited from preparing this presentation. This is a work in progress, and therefore I still make various realizations along the way about how this subject should be treated the way I consider it. So what I will do here today is that I will read some parts from the introduction. And I mean, when I say introduction, it's an introduction to what will be a short monograph. So it will be a presentation of the project, and then in this presentation I will sketch the project, and then I will read a little part of a concluding section where I summarize some of my findings. So this is the way I have planned it, and I hope that I will be able to make sense of it along the way. So let me start simply by reading this part of the introduction to present my approach to this subject. So today, in the traditional homelands of Western modernity, there is a widespread experience of crisis. Main material challenges are mostly presented as economic and ecological, but within many societies there are also increased perceptions of social, political, and cultural malaise. To conceptualize adequately the perceived misery, it has again become common to refer to the classical critique of modern society in terms of alienation. The alienation towards contemporary realized democracy brings to memory the alienation toward what was in the 20th century called realized socialism, or real existing socialism, that is Soviet Russia and its affiliates around the world. In this sense, the alienation experienced in modernity can thus be directed towards social and political realities conceived of as pathological, and this is the point of departure for the present argument. As a critical expression of discontent, alienation has proved to retain a strong intuitive appeal, and it is therefore worth, I think, looking more into its potentials for normative critique guiding political action. However, even if alienation is perceived to be widespread, taking seriously the responsibility for coming generations, and as a philosopher of education, this is kind of my approach, we must insist on conceiving alienation as possible to overcome or mitigate conceptually and historically through theoretical work as well as through practice. Passing on reality to those to come, if conceptualizing critique in terms of alienation, we must provide a concept that is possible to negate and thus sublate by some kind of human activity, be that through revolution, political reform, or education. In other words, speaking as a philosopher of education, I must insist on the possibility of empowering and raising collective consciousness that enables us to govern ourselves in a rational and reasonable way, be that in the family or in the workplace, in the village councils, in the parliament, or the General Assembly of the United Nations. This is what education in a democracy is for. That being so, education is not restricted to children. Continued education, such as democratic citizenship education, forms a necessary condition for realizing and sustaining a genuine and robust social democracy. Being partly inspired by Jürgen Habermas, I have already argued elsewhere that democratic citizenship education must combine insights from both socialism, liberalism, and republicanism, but also that the successful education to real social democracy must transcend these well-established social and political agenda, ultimately endorsing a very broad conception of the political that stimulates added emphasis on cultural and aesthetic issues. My overall philosophical ambition is thus to facilitate conceptually education and thereby citizenship education for social democracy. The assumption being, however, that in the real world of contemporary capitalism, this ambition is challenged in particular by alienation. Nevertheless, the assumption is also that alienation can be conceived of as something that can be coped with, and this assumption draws in particular on conceptual resources from the German tradition of humanist educational thought. So this is kind of the overall approach to what I'm doing. So one could say it's more praxis orientated than empirically orientated. Recuperating the idea of alienation in an educational perspective, one must relate to the fact that alienation has been a crucial element in different kinds of critical reflections on the human predicament of modernity, and that consequently there has been strong disagreement about what the term alienation is supposed to signify. Of course, alienation refers to something presumably well-known and familiar becoming alien and unfamiliar. But when further specification is undertaken, almost immediately principled conflicts surface. Hence, in the 20th century philosophy, discussing alienation, typically two different philosophical leanings or approaches can be detected as potentially in conflict, namely on the one side, various kinds of existentialism, and on the other side, various kinds of Marxism. Both within the two camps and across camps, subjectivity and objectivity are issues to consider in the discussion. When rounding up the present work, and that was this summer, in the leading intellectual weekly in Denmark, there was an encyclopedic column simply called Fremmedgørelse, which is the Danish word for alienation, where the first statement was that it's a fundamental human condition. That is the most classical existentialist statement. A few lines later, however, it is said that in Marxist theory, it is one of the evils of capitalism. One does not, it said, possess one's own workforce, but have to sell it piece by piece. And at the assembly line, one does not understand what one produces, only that somebody else will have the profit. These distinctions between subjectivity and objectivity, empirical work and philosophy, and within philosophy, between existentialism and Marxism, has been around for decades and may be considered classical for the discussion of alienation. Displacing the current constructivist trends in social and political philosophy, including critical theory, in the present argument for reintroducing the critique of alienation, I will take seriously a speculative and metaphysical focus on history, economy, and philosophical anthropology, bringing to the fore elements of the original Hegelian Marxist analysis of alienation that have not, to my knowledge, and I might become corrected on this issue, that has not, on my knowledge, been sufficiently taken into consideration in contemporary philosophical discussion. In contrast to Rahel Jägi and Hartmut Rosa, whom I have discussed critically in more detail elsewhere, Marx's concept of human flourishment and alienation certainly demonstrate what we in some parts of philosophy would call a certain thickness. And even though in some Marxist discussions, this question of human nature may still be considered controversial, as I have argued elsewhere, classical humanism is worth developing also today, not least in relation to education. Having in addition already discussed the pre-Marxist origin of the idea of alienation, in particular as they appear in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, in this work I discuss the Marxist approach to alienation, taking seriously the material challenges of neoliberal capitalist estrangement, reification, and commodification. My hope is that adding substance to a comprehensive conception of alienation will stimulate a constructive normative critique of the aforementioned malaise of contemporary modernity in a way that will raise the interest in education. This being the project in the present argument, much attention will be attributed to the locus classicus with regard to Marx's concept of alienation, the economic and philosophical manuscript of 1844, also known as the Paris manuscript, first published in 1932 and sometimes recognized as the first draft of Marx's system. So this means, let's see here, if I can change a little bit what I'm. So this was what I was doing for kind of general introduction. Now, the way that I have structured my monograph, the paper that I have linked to gives a sequence of paragraphs from A to O. That was kind of the way I progressed when I worked this summer, and I finished the work in August. But now coming back to the work, and then I can see that there is maybe an overall structure that would be beneficial to mention somehow, to see how I worked. So what I did first was that I situated my arguments. That was in the first three paragraphs, the first three sections, A, B, and C. Then I went into the discussion of the 20th century, reading various Marxists discussing, disentangling the idea of alienation, comparing various key concepts. And that was a long work, and it has taken, I mean, it was not only this summer, it has been a work that has been going on for the last, on and off for the last, how many years? Almost 5 years I've been having this work progressing slowly. So I scrutinized the basic concepts, and I went into the Marxist controversies to disentangle what I believed was the core, also the core of what was the original Marx argument. So then I finally got to the point where I thought I could say how one should read these manuscripts from 1844. And then in the end, I have returned to my general agenda, showing that read in a proper way, this manuscript of the 1844 of Marx would actually be productive to read again, to strengthen my both critical but also I would say constructive political agenda. So, and this is the way it develops and I have emphasized introduction because that's where I was just reading something, and I will also and I will continue kind of going a little more into detail what is going on, and then I will actually read a part from a section from part 4. So, I mean, this will be the agenda. So let me first try to sketch just what's going on in the first part. Having thus presented the overall idea of the project, I will now turn to presenting the work that I've done in relation to alienation. As an almost classical subject, alienation relates to a plethora of discussions in social and political philosophy. Actually, continuing conversation we had before the lecture, there are plenty of indications that some sociologists consider alienation as almost constitutive to sociology as a field. But I, as an introduction, situate my approach in relation to current critical theory discussions, in particular about capitalism. And here I relate to the conversation between Rahel Yegi and Nancy Fraser. And then I also relate to some current discussions on history and the division of labor to say that I consider alienation more in relation to property than in relation to the division of labor. And then finally, in the first part, I argue for the necessity of politics and education for social progress. And that is in contrast to those Marxists that says that the social revolution is not political. So, I mean, this is the way I situate my arguments. Then when I try to dig into the key concepts, I discuss some contemporary definitions of alienation stemming from different languages. And the languages that I use are apart from English, German, French, and Spanish, and my own language, which is Danish. And I want to point out some problems related to the multilingual roots of the present subject matter. This is, however, not merely conceptual history, descriptive analysis, or terminological clarification. It's the first indication of the normative and critical potential for guiding political action of employing the concept of alienation, namely to make it part of a critique of capitalism and political economy, emphasizing that alienation in its most comprehensive sense has a legal as well as a pathological aspect, the combination of which I believe to fuel social critique and potentially political action. That is section D. Section E, I follow Herbert Marcuse's path-breaking interpretation from 1932 of Marx's manuscripts. Firstly, arguing to distinguish between alienation, renunciation, reification, and estrangement. Secondly, I recognize the complication, and that is in section F, the complication due to the translation of German language discussion into English, that we should continue considering alienation the key issue to discuss rather than estrangement, just as we should uphold a conceptual distinction between alienation and renunciation. And for those who are German-related, alienation and renunciation here are Entfremdung and Entäußerung, preferring in both cases the former due to its comprehensiveness, its intuitive critical appeal, and its promise of practical transcendence. So that is transcendence. So that is the reason why we should prefer alienation instead of renunciation, Entfremdung instead of Entäußerung. And then in section G, In order to pursue this practical philosophical project, I commend Marcuse's interpretation of Hegel and Marx from the 1930s and 40s, and consequently also Marcuse's classical philosophical approach to critical theory, that is, metaphysical realism, subject philosophy, and philosophy of consciousness. Having elsewhere defended classical critical theory, and distanced myself from the post-metaphysical agenda of contemporary critical theory and post-metaphysical agenda of contemporary critical theory, that is from Habermas, Honneth, and ongoing. Where was I? Well, yeah, having myself distant from the post-metaphysical agenda of contemporary critical theory, and in particular the proposed universalization of the experience of alienation in modernity, and those who propose the universalization of the experience of alienation in modernity could be, for example, Rahel Jägi and Hartmut Rosa. I endorse instead the Hegelian idea of work in Marx's expressivist philosophical anthropology and Marx's criticism of forced labor, connecting the critique of alienation with the critique of capitalism. So, I mean, that was the way that I tried to disentangle alienation from the 20th century discussion in general. And then I start focusing on the Marxist discussion more in particular. So this makes it relevant, I think, to consider the relation between alienation, renunciation, and exteriorization. And that is because exteriorization is important for the metaphysics of work in Hegel and Marx. Since conflating these concepts, alienation, renunciation, and exteriorization, as all expressing fundamental existential living conditions, implies, I would argue, a concept of alienation that threatens to make political and educational initiatives toward a better world appear as futile. In continuation, I revisit the late 20th century Marxist controversy concerning alienation, showing why it became such a crucial issue for the so-called real existing socialism of the bygone Soviet bloc. The problem was that if alienation could not be criticized as intrinsically and exclusively linked to capitalist relation of production, there was less reason to accept the all too obvious deficiencies of allegedly socialist Soviet regime. That was section I. In section J, I say, well, I believe that beyond still these political apologetics of the bygone regime, there is a critical argument worth retaining. So even if it was made for political reason, this argument, I still think there's a critical nerve in it. Hence, if alienation is perceived as a universal human condition, or it is provoked by the division of labor and modern technology, and not the existence of private property and commodities, as it was in fact argued by humanists with reference to Marx, then the radical and transformative critique of capitalism would appear less relevant and socialism less attractive in terms of the good life. Today, when the desirability and legitimacy of capitalist relations of production are too often simply taken for granted, I therefore propose to take seriously the worries of the Soviet side of the discussion. Moreover, and this is section K, instead of thinking of the critique of alienation and of political economy as mutually exclusive, with the inspiration precisely from Marx's manuscripts, I take these two issues to be two aspects of the same critique of capitalism. As I argue, human being is understood as becoming alienated under capitalism mainly by being deprived of the product of work due to societal enforcement of private property rights. Alienation is thus implied by capitalist exploitation, and as such, it should be handled through social democratic politics, economy, and law, that is, as an objective societal condition in need of change, not merely as a subjective human experience regarding the meaning of life or technological innovation. And that's having cleared all the ground, I can now get to my interpretation of how one should read these 1844 manuscripts. So an important step, and this is section L, in this direction is to reconstruct the manuscripts in a way that facilitates the understanding of the crucial role that alienation plays in the critique of political economy. Almost all editions of the manuscripts organize the text, making Marx's analysis of alienated work appear as an independent chapter after the critical analysis of the three components of price in Adam Smith's National Economics, that is, wage, profit, and rent. In fact, however, Marx developed the critique of alienation within the critical analysis of the latter three categories, ultimately arguing that alienation is not only the worker's experience of the object and the work process becoming alien and man becoming alien to himself and his fellow human beings, but also the unjust transfer of value from the producer to the proprietor due to property rights. In section M, for Marx, criticizing alienation implies criticizing the political economy of capitalism. When it comes to wage, this is the result of the struggle between worker and capitalist, where the former is destined to lose. Basically, value is produced by the utility to an object added through work. The worker thus produces the value, but in a capitalist society, due to property rights, value is alienated. Here comes alienation, this term. Value is alienated to the capitalist where it is accumulated. So value is alienated by being transferred. The fundamental contradiction of Smith's National Economics is that it purports to contribute to the wealth of nation, but in reality it leads to the misery of the majority of society, namely the working class. And now comes a short presentation of the section that I will read from afterwards. Section N. As an expression of human being, work itself is exteriorization and objectifying, and thus potentially estranging. However, under capitalism, the renunciation of the product makes possible private property, and thus the alienation of the produced value. Economic alienation due to private property relation thus involves both the alienation of the produced product in relation to the worker and the alienation of surplus value from the worker to the proprietor. This I will go into more detail afterwards. Then in the last section, those of you who have consulted my manuscript may notice that I have added an extra word after O, a P, and that is because I realized that actually most of what I wrote in the conclusion would actually be more correct to make it an own section that brings back the argument to where I started. So I will change my manuscript there. But the idea is that the critique of alienation transcends technology and economy. The answer to the challenge of economic alienation being thus at first political. And this is by suggestion of Marx. Maybe surprisingly, Marx's idea of communism reveals a very comprehensive concept of politics that does not only emphasize the question of distributive justice, but recognizes societal life as ideally enriched democratically by education, arts, and scholarship. And this is a conception of politics that I think merits continued attention, also when reformist social democracy is preferred to revolutionary communism. In politics, the sovereign rights of the individual that are said to be inalienable are alienated to the state. Hence, politics necessarily implies transferring, that is, alienating sovereignty from the citizen to the state. And ideally, I would say this is a social democratic state of law, which of course is very much different from what is mostly called social democracy in real life. So, but in general, and this will conclude my presentation here. In general, I argue for a metaphysical realist understanding of alienation in terms of the unfulfilled promises of modernity due to capitalism and militarism. Hence, employing the rich Hegelian philosophical anthropology, metaphysical concepts become available to understand work as a conscious activity, as well as the coming to self-consciousness through more or less radical consciousness raising processes of experience, in particular politics and education. The comprehensive political economical critique of alienation implies the need for a continued public education, including citizenship education. To have practical impact, however, the critique of alienation also implies expanding the idea of education to make it appear both meaningful and attractive, even to alienated citizens of real-life capitalist democracies. And this is where Marx's idea of communism becomes important. Hence, with such an understanding of alienation and education, it becomes possible for educators, pupils, and citizens at large to recognize the unused potentials for human flourishment in existing societal reality. And that is, I mean, the idea is that communism presents such a beautiful and in Marx's description in these manuscripts, presents such a beautiful and persuasive idea, so it will be so radical, so it will grab people's attention. So they can recognize the unused potential for human flourishment in existing societal reality, and maybe even conceive of some kind of politically mediated reconciliation with societal reality. This would complete the way from critique of capitalism to establishing a social democracy. So this is the whole way around. And then I had some thoughts about how to continue this, and I hope I've chosen correctly, but if not, this is kind of the framework we have to work within. So what I will do is I will take this 3 pages section, and then I will read that, and I hope that this will answer some of the questions that I may have raised now by this introduction. So, section N. This is where it's important to remember the width of semantic meaning covered by the term alienation. And this is what I have discussed in part, especially in part 2. Alienation is not only about experiencing the product as alien, but also about value being alienated from the producer to the proprietor of the product. As a Swedish-German sociologist, Joachim Israel, mentions, alienation has, and he has a monograph on alienation from the 1980s. Alienation has a certain double meaning, and one must be attentive to the tendency to psychologization, that is, reducing alienation to psychology. Considering the economy of the production process, work creates value since the resulting product becomes more useful and enjoyable, and therefore also attractive to consume or buy on the market. Work thus creates use value, exchange value, and ultimately capital. However, when the right to private property applies to raw materials, means of production, products, and capital, this alienates the produced value, which is transferred to the property owners. The worker's forced renunciation of his product due to property rights means that outside him or her, there comes to exist an independent alien power, and here I quote Marx, and that life from where the object arises presents itself as hostile and alien. In general, Marx thus stresses that what is produced, things as well as value, when renounced and disposed of as independent entities, can become alien and hostile, thus turning towards the producers. This happened historically under feudalism as well as under capitalism. In the latter case, most acutely with the accumulation of capital, resulting, for instance, in the offensive demonstration of wealth that Marx also describes. As Marx argues, recognizing the rights to private property, the workers alienate the value of their work to the capitalists. The process, however, also goes the other way around, and that is where the different connotations of the German words Entfremdung and Entäußerung becomes relevant. Private property is thus created as, again Marx, as a result, the necessary consequence of renunciated work. This is the basic dialectics of national economy, which means that work as a process of exteriorization tending towards renunciation also enables alienation in the legal sense just used, and ultimately also in the pathological sense. It has been noticed that alienation implies a spatial separation, but that is already the case with the renunciation of the product. I mean, when you renounce the product. Hence, when Marx claims that the concept of private property can be found through the analysis of the concept of alienated, renunciated work, again I quote, he does not, as Marcuse or a person that I rely quite a lot on, a scholar called Margaret Alice Fay, who wrote a fantastic monograph on the Paris manuscript in the 1980s. So he does not, Marx, as Marcuse and Fay may lead us to think, identify the two terms. So I would claim that Marx does not identify Entfremdung and Entäußerung. Rather, he refers to two separate processes or two different aspects of the same process. That is, a process that may be parallel or sequential, one being metaphysical, the other being economical. It is renunciation or surrender of the product in time and space that enables transferring the value added by the work, but the two processes are not the same. They must be distinguished analytically, even though in the detailed and precise dialectical analysis, they must be considered both apart and together as part of the same totality. As Fay stresses, through Hegelian dialectics, Marx synthesizes what empirically are separate phenomena. Regarding renunciation, that is Entäußerung, as already indicated, initially Marx follows Hegelian metaphysics and anthropology, where work is exteriorization of oneself into an object that gets its own identity and independency. However, what was initially only exteriorized through work and objectified as a result of work, that is, as an independent product, now has to be surrendered by the producer due to private property rights of another. Objectivation and the independency of the product in itself are thus sources of distance, separation, and estrangement. And having to renounce the product produced due to its being owned by somebody else adds to the basic estrangement, objectively as well as subjectively. The result being ultimately alienation as both legal transfer and a pathology. That is a pathological, I would say, legal transfer, since capitalism with its system of law is a historical pathology that must be overcome. In Marx's word, the objectification presents itself as a loss of the object, that the worker has been robbed of his necessary objects, not only for his life, but also for his work. Hence, as Marcuse argues, already in the initial exteriorization, there is a tendency to surrendering or renouncing the final products. Already in the objectification, there is a tendency to reification. Hence, Reification and renunciation are not merely contingent historical facts, they belong to human being. Regarding alienation, for Marx, there are subjective as well as objective aspects. Alienation arises from the fact that my provisions, again, I quote Marx, my provisions for living are another's. That's what is my, alienation arises from the fact that my provisions for living are another's. That what is my wish is the property of another. Hence, due to recognized and enforced property rights of the value added by my work to the value provided to by nature, a substantial part of it is transferred to the proprietor, namely the value that exceeds the value of my waged labor. Again, Marx, wage is an immediate consequence of the alienated work, and the alienated work is the immediate cause of private property. I mean, this is the idea of alienation as transfer that is also included in Marx's analysis. The alienation of surplus value is accumulated as capital, and therefore ultimately capital is also the product of labor. Both renunciation and alienation are processes that take place in reality and can be experienced as such. As it has been remarked, my renunciation happens in the world. Both cases, renunciation and alienation, can be considered ontologically and epistemologically, calling attention to historical, existential, or phenomenological issues. None of them can therefore be reduced to simply being individual subjective experiences or psychological pathologies. And that one could say that's one of the positions that I argue against. It is reducing alienation to a psychological pathology. The processes are real as determining metaphysical and economical process, especially in a capitalist society. But one can be more or less aware of them. Hence, one can have more or less clear consciousness of the reality of alienation, and therefore also have a false consciousness about being alienated, typically due to the discursive hegemony of the ruling ideology. And I endorse this idea of false consciousness in contrast to many other people also within critical theory. As I have argued recently, a classical ideology critique is still important, and the critique of political economy is a prime example of this genre. I have discussed critical theory with other critical theories in various journals. Finally, recognizing the difference of the two issues, that is Entfremdung and Erneuerung, alienation and renunciation. When criticizing capitalism, I still believe that alienation is what we should focus on rather than renunciation. That is Entfremdung rather than Erneuerung. As Marx argues, private property is the material resumed expression of renunciated work. Had Marx argued in English, he could have used alienation, but in German, he had to use Erneuerung instead of Entfremdung. Ultimately, renunciation is thus the material and logical precondition of private property. But when Marx considers the relation between worker and non-worker that he considers pathological, then the appropriation, again Marx's word, the appropriation presents itself as alienation, the self-activity as the activity of another, the liveliness as self-sacrifice of the life, the production of objects as the loss of objects to an alien power, an alien human being. Hence, when Marx used two words in my English language argument, I need only one, namely alienation. Hence, the comprehensive idea of alienation has huge critical and normative potential. And that was what I was looking for. Comprising separation, estrangement, hostility, pathology, and the loss of value that are the result of forced labor due to private property under capitalism. This is why we should make the critique of alienation, with all its intuitive appeal, a core issue in the critique of political economy. In fact, the idea of alienation was discussed within political economy up until at least Samuelson's economics in the 1980s, but then it disappeared out of economy. In the legal sense, alienation is the transfer of value from one person to another, but alienation is also something inescapably pathological. Overcoming alienation not mean overcoming the capitalist pathology of the legal transfer of value, changing thus the basic property relations of society. In his critique of capitalism, Marx calls attention to the fact that producers do not have to surrender their products. Those who add value to the things provided by nature do not have to alienate this value to others. It's only due to the actual societal recognition and enforcement of private property rights that free work becomes alienated as forced labor, transferring value to be accumulated as capital elsewhere. It is the capitalist condition of production that makes normal the transfer of value from the one who in fact adds values to the things to the one who merely owns the things. The worker thus creating surplus value and accumulating capital for the non-worker. This is why the product of labor, that is both the specific product and the value produced, presents itself as alien to the worker. The merit of Marx is to point out the historical character of the private ownership to the means of production necessary for human being. As Fay points out, Marx argues that Smith in his National Economics overlooks both that it's a specific kind of generalized, unrestricted private property that is a necessary condition for national economics as such, and that this specific kind of private property is a social relation that has developed historically from feudal property of land. Adam Smith, thus fails to realize that the most fundamental categories of his national economics are historical, whereas Marx clearly states that landed property is the first form of private property. Workers in a capitalist society are free persons. Workers in capitalist society as free persons are thus constituted by a historical process of alienation, being first alienated from their land by the feudal seizure of land that included the seizure of the people that lived on the land. The grand theft made the feudal lord, and this is something that Marx describes, the grand theft made the feudal lord the proprietor of both land and people, the latter thus being robbed by the former and thus alienated from it. Subsequently, however, in the process, people were alienated again in the process leading from feudalism to capitalism, this time being alienated by being robbed of their access to the land as their livelihood. That is, by becoming, sometimes by force, free labor. This sets into motion a final process of alienation, namely within capitalism, where the worker becomes alienated in the famous 4 senses of Marx, a process that is accelerated by the social division of labor. Marx thus reconstructs the historical constitution of feudal property that was initiated by robbing the farmers of the land they worked on. That is, alienating man from land, even though land with its vital resources is and should be, as one of Marx's commentators emphasizes, absolutely inalienable from man. This is a process of alienation in a very comprehensive sense. The farmers thus being firstly alienated from both their means of production and their means of subsistence by the brutal theft of the feudal lords. Secondly, subdued forcibly into the process of alienation just described, exteriorizing and objectifying themselves through work turned into labor, surrendering and renouncing of the product, and in the process also alienating the value produced to the feudal proprietors. Marx emphasizes the particular determinate character of the feudal renunciation, where agriculture is the only productive labor, where nature is the source of value rather than abstract labor and capital. As Marx makes clear, we are dealing with a historical development. And here I have a quote from Marx's manuscript. The difference between capital and earth, between profit and land rent, and between both and wages, between industry and agriculture, between immovable and movable private property, is a historical difference, a fixed historical moment in the formation and development in the conflict between capital and labor. End of quote. When Marx celebrates capital's, as he calls, civilized victory, he recognizes the structural strength of capitalism in relation to feudalism, emphasizing thus the progression of the historical process. As Margaret Alice Fay stresses, for Marx, private property itself exercises an alien power over human being, which has historical roots in the feudal society. Neither private property nor alienation began with commodity production and the market for private sellers and buyers. They both go back. I mean, both commodity production and alienation go back to the separation of producers from the means of production that was institutionalized under feudalism. Hence, there is also continuity in the development of alienation from feudalism to capitalism. And since this development is a result of human action, it can also be changed by the same means. That means that one can still make political, educational, and revolutionary changes. Moreover, as a Hegelian, Marx considers history a dialectical process of sublating contradictions. According to Fay, the third speculative stage in Hegel's method reveals the hidden unity of a contradiction. And for Marx, this means unifying issues which at the abstract stage, for instance by Smith, are considered independent empirical phenomena, that is, private property and alienated work. As Marx emphasizes, national economics takes the fact of private property for granted. It does not explain it. National economy, he says, thus only gives an abstract account of the material process. It does not conceive of the law, that is, the laws that govern capital and market. And now I will, this will be actually the last section I will read to you, and then I will hopefully open the floor for discussion. As Margaret Alice Fay emphasizes, for Marx, property and alienation are processes that are intimately linked to each other and to the objective material working conditions. The movement of the one is also the movement of the other. And as she argues, the unity of opposites become a Hegelian unity in the third speculative stage. What national economics takes for granted, that is, private property and production, Marx explains as historical phenomena, which in turn ultimately explains the real and material contradiction of political economy, namely that work creates wealth that is accumulated as dead labor, but as it was already noticed by Adam Smith, that living work, that is the working class, and these are words that Marx already uses in this young stage or this early stage. Well, here I've stumbled over something that I should have simply continued. But as it was already noticed by Adam Smith, that living work, that is the working class, is characterized by misery and impotence. This is the consequence of the products being governed inhumanely by laws, the laws just mentioned, rather than by the workers themselves. Workers are therefore alienated by capitalism in the most comprehensive sense possible. And as I've mentioned a few times, this is why we should retain a critique of alienation as integrated in a critique of capitalist relations of production. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Asger. It was really interesting. Actually, I will open the floor to the others, so I will be last. But I have my notes here, and I just want beforehand to thank you for your presence. So please, Andrew, you have the word.
If I could say a few words. First of all, thank you very, very much. This was quite insightful, a quite broad discussion of alienation on a number of terms. And I'm grateful that we've had the opportunity to have you with us. I have a comment and a brief question. I'll start with the comment. Historically, the early manuscripts, the 1844 manuscripts, became associated with what's come to be called Western Marxism. Okay, that process took a step further, I would suggest, in the United States, when there was, there's strange forms of Marxism that came into circulation in the United States in the middle of in the third quarter of the 20th century, because there were forms of Marxism that they called themselves Marxists, but they were really very social democratic to the point that they were social democratic, perhaps is overstating it. They were looking for a kind of Marx that was non-political, certainly non-revolutionary, right? It was a kind of Marxism that appealed to intellectuals, as happened in North America, in the United States, as happened with the influence of others as well, such as Trotsky, right? You're talking about people who didn't want to be mainstream Marxist-Leninists, and they searched for ways of doing that in the way that they could call themselves Marxists, but at the same time unburden themselves, perhaps subconsciously, of the effort to be politically involved. You could talk, but it's not necessarily working class politics, right? This is another subject, or this could be a long discussion in and of itself, but I just wanted to mention that just as a personal observation. This kind of phenomenon that occurred in North America didn't necessarily even think of social change through political action the way, Western Marxists in Europe say all the same, they were nevertheless interested in some sort of social improvement. Whereas, the kind of new left is what they call themselves in the States, but people who talked about the early manuscripts, I think they talked about the early manuscripts so they wouldn't have to bother reading Capital. It's kind of a strange thing, but that's okay. That's another discussion. The brief question, though, is you didn't use the word commodity, I don't believe, in your presentation. I would think that one of the unique characteristics of alienation under capitalist production is that it's a commodity production. Alienation under the feudal regime didn't necessarily involve commodity production, or only in certain small, you go to the market on Thursday and sell something, right? But it wasn't necessarily it wasn't agricultural production, wasn't commodity production in quite the same way as it was in the industrial production of commodities. So, I want to know why you thought it useful not to speak of commodity production as something unique to capitalism. You implied it, of course, but I don't think, used the word.
What do you say, Umberto? Should I simply answer, Andrew? Or how do you?
I believe it's up to you. Let's.
Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
please.
Okay, but then you must tell me if I somehow do not follow your usual norms. I mean, you're perfectly right, both in your commentary and your question, that that there is a tendency in my reading that goes in the direction of yeah, one could call an intellectualized preoccupation with the young Marx. So, and to take the last question first, first, matter of commodity, as far as I understand it, and I plead guilty to the suspicion of reading the manuscripts and not having done the work to read the Capital. But as far as I understand it, yes, commodity production is constitutive, and that means a necessary constitutive element in the alienation of capitalism. And I actually mentioned it along the way. I credit Herbert Marcuse for emphasizing commodity production and commodification as constitutive, and therefore that he should, rather than take the Lukács idea of reification, he should himself had stayed with a term like commodification, which would be more precise, because both for himself but also in general. So I mean, I think at that point I'm with a rather mainstream Marxist interpretation of the logic of alienation, if there's a mainstream around alienation. But I mean, I think it's rather uncontroversial. So I mean, it's just because in this section it's not something that I stressed very much. I think I mentioned commodification once, but it's so I mean, this, I think it's but when it comes to the first commentary, then there is these tendencies that you observe. And I mean, I haven't been, in fact, I've only been in the US once. So I mean, I have no real good experiences about how the New Left works in how it worked in the US. And I haven't read many American Marxists. In fact, I must admit that I never considered myself a Marxist until I realized a few years ago that I had probably become, due to my intellectual upbringing in the 1980s, I probably become what I would call a cultural Marxist. So that the categories of my formation have been formed a lot by the discourses that were taking place in Europe, and especially, of course, in Denmark in the 1980s. And they were, around me, influenced a lot by Western Marxism in particular, but also about some more Eastern Bloc Marxists. So I mean, this is part of my upbringing. So, and even if I don't consider myself a Marxist, I can recognize myself within some of the categories that you mentioned, namely, as I just mentioned, one who focus on the humanist Marxist, not focusing on the capital, and also defending that it should actually be meaningful. One could say that especially in section 3, I discuss some of these, not section, part 3, the sections H, I, and J. I discuss in some detail precisely these discussions between various kinds of Marxists in the late 20th century. It was very precise. We said the third quarter of 20th century. So I discuss with some of the Soviet participants and some of other participants. Not that I read Russian, but they have been translated into various languages. And I also include some Yugoslav philosophers from that period, Petrovic and Markovic and others. So I mean, I'm aware of this issue. I also discuss. I try to defend to take seriously alienation at all, trying to say precisely that alienation should be not in contrast to critique of political economy, but as part of political economy. So that is part of the critique of political economy. So that is my strategy. And here I benefit a lot from a fantastic work that I also mentioned from Margaret Alice Fay from the 1980s. So I mean, I can easily recognize myself in some of your comments, but also say that I haven't taken this road to as an easy way to identify myself as a Marxist. It's rather trying to get to terms with something that I was raised up with when I was a student.
If I could just add one thing, I think the pre-communist manifesto writings, Poverty of Philosophy, German Ideology, 1844 manuscripts, I think they're very valuable. I don't think that reading one of those works inherently makes one an intellectualized, an overly intellectualized political activist. Let's put it that way, because there is valuable material in them. Of course, humanist Marxism in and of itself is not a bad thing. I would suggest that the reason that those manuscripts, the earlier works, especially 1844 manuscripts, I would suggest that the reason they didn't take more of a central role in the intellectual political development in Eastern and Central Europe was because there were people who wanted to preserve a harder line, a harder Marxist-Leninist line. They had some sense that perhaps of what was going on in Western Europe, perhaps of what was going on in North America. I can't speak to that in detail, but there were humanist Marxist organizations in the United States that won cases against the federal government, showing that they were subject to political repression by proving in federal courts that the majority of their members were federal agents.
That's really
and so I guess there were people who wanted to protect themselves from that possibility. That put the 1844, the pre-1848 manuscripts aside a bit. I just wanted to add that comment. So.
But let me just add something for clarification, that I recognize the problems that the Marxist-Leninists had with coping with alienation. First, that it was excluded from the German edition that started in the 1950s, and then later on there was this distinction between the young Marx and the early Marx that was emphasized very much by the French structuralist in the Althusser tradition. But then there was also precisely the third strategy, and that is actually the strategy that I adopt, namely integrating the critique of alienation into the critique of capitalism. And this was undertaken by some late Marxist-Leninists. So I take side with some of the Soviet arguments against the humanist Marxist, and that's for me, with my upbringing in the Western Marxism, that was kind of for me myself a bit surprising that I ended up actually accepting that alienation in the existentialist variation could take up too much attention from the critique of capitalism. I mean, in that way, I accepted the worries of the Soviet side of the discussion more than the humanist Marxist. So.
If I may pose something, actually, what you propose in your work is that alienation comprises an umbrella of subcategories of elements which they are intertwined within the capitalistic framework, like exteriorization, renunciation, estrangement, and so on. But my question is, for example, in Latin America, the Marxist experience in Latin America, it has been more like giving consciousness or trying to give consciousness to the working class. We have kind of intellectualized Marx so we can achieve and get to the masses which we couldn't, given Bolsonaro's and the far right upsurge in the beginning of the century, right? But my question is, at the beginning, you talk about education as a way to overcome alienation, because alienation, as you said, is surpassable, right? We can overcome this. And I keep thinking about all these other economic modes that have been rising, like shared economies or cooperatives or green economies and all the other efforts to overcome the capitalistic framework, right? So in this regard, and together with this, you are against the reductionism to a psychological symptom, to a psychological effect, but however, there is this psychological effect together with the others, together with the framework. So my question is, how could that be possible to transform this theoretical framework into a practical stance, into giving consciousness to the masses and to the working class especially, right, about all these effects of the capitalist system, right? So my true question here is how to transform the theory to the practice, because in theory it's amazing, and I like the way you have how can I say, separated the elements of such a complex concept, which is alienation. But how can we bring that to this collective consciousness that you've mentioned, right? How can we heal this psychological dimension of alienation?
But you said two questions.
Two questions at once.
Okay. Okay. Yes, because I mean, I think you indicated at least the way that I would proceed, and I will also, actually that is what I'm working on now, namely how to look forward, and for me the important issue is to make economy genuinely political. And to make economy genuinely political, you have also indicated precisely some of the experiments that have been tried, cooperatives and communes and various kinds of planned economy, thinking over what should be done with economy. And that means that some of the experiments, for instance, that was done in the former Yugoslavia in Europe and other places around the world should be taken seriously, because from my argument, the most important factor in this complex process is private property rights. It is the private property right, and here I agree with what I take to be Marx's argument. It is the private property rights that enables alienation in this most comprehensive sense, namely as a transfer of value and the transfer of product from the producer to the non-producer. So, and what does that mean? Does that mean, and that's something where I also try to be precise in the manuscript, does that mean that we should have no property rights? No, Marx, I think, is very precise himself. He said he used Hegelian terminology and says that we should sublate, that is the German, very famous Hegelian German notion of Aufhebung. We should sublate the property rights, so that we should have a true property. And what does that mean when it's demystifying and more practical? That means that we should look for various kinds of property rights that can be a combination of something private, something communal, something social, something of the state, and try to find a way where we can cope with this transformation, with this necessary transfer of value. And in the end of the manuscript, I precisely discuss the necessity of some kind of alienation. This in a political sense, if we go back to Rousseau, he used the idea of alienation in his social contract as what is necessary when it comes to transferring rights from the individual to the state. We can only have politics if we transfer some rights from the individual to the state. Even if we go to an assembly, when we vote, that means that we transfer our rights from our individual perspective to some kind of communality. So alienation in this sense is a necessity. And I would say also in the economic sense, it is necessary to build society that we should give some of the value that we produce to some kind of non-working common entity, like a state, like a commune. I mean, there is a necessary alienation of value. But the thing is that in capitalism, in capitalist and militarist modernity, there has been exaggerated alienation. There has been exaggerated transfer of value and rights. And here I can employ a beautiful distinction made by Herbert Marcuse, namely between the necessary repression of society and the surplus repression of society. So I can say there is a necessary alienation of society, both economical and political, but there should not be surplus alienation. And how to find the balance in a democratic process. This is very difficult, but it is a matter of recognizing human beings as entities worthy of respect in processes that includes dialogues and various kinds of deliberations. So I mean, it's not an easy process, and I have recently started actually to turn to. I mean, in other aspects, I've turned to Latin America. Like, I mean, I'm in Buenos Aires now, but I've actually recently started looking up some of the possibilities that Paulo Freire will give, because he has actually some ideas about this process and how to get from the very high intellectual categories into a process there. And I actually brought it with me here, also because I thanks to one of my dedicated students, I've just realized that the most common Frere translations into English, the ones used in the 1980s, is actually very misleading. I mean, as I read Frere in Spanish, I cannot read Portuguese, sorry. But when I read him in Spanish, and I consider that rather close, that must be close to the Portuguese edition. So there I can see that Frere wants to take education into society, out of schools, but into all kinds of social relations. And therefore he wants to get away from teacher-pupil relation and get into educator-educatee as a general expression. But this idea gets totally lost in all the American translation that I know of, where you translate this into just another way of conceptualizing teacher-pupil relation within the school. So, I mean, the whole idea of Frere, of getting education out of the institutions, out to the praxis, gets lost. And this is followed also in the Danish translation that relies very much on the English translation. So, I mean, there is something there that I'm looking to, how to get it into practice. So, I mean, one thing is economy. And here I must tell you a recent discovery of mine, namely that Robert Dahl, the father of American democracy studies, can be, I think, a great help. I brought here with me for further study his last, I think it was his last book. Actually, I brought two of his books, Democracy and Its Critics, which is rather well known, but also Preface to Economic Democracy. And there he has an argument precisely which is similar to what I think, similar to what I want, to democratize, and this is from the 1980s, these two books, to democratize economy. So he thinks it's absurd, he says. It's absurd to retain the idea of private property that was developed by John Locke and other liberal economists in the 17th century. It's absurd to retain this idea and to use it to let it legitimize monopoly corporations like we know them today. So it seems that when something has so much public importance, then it cannot be private. That's the argument. I mean, when Google and Elon Musk and all the rest of them has so much public importance or significance, then it cannot be private. And then this is, I think, a very good argument that is worth pursuing. So, I mean, there is how to get it into praxis. Economy should be political, and political should be democratic in some way, and this we have to get into education in some way.
Thank you very much. If anyone else, please, Andrew. Those who have comments or questions, please, you can raise the hand. Please, Andrew.
I'm not sure if this is a comment or a question, or whether I'm interested in your opinion in some way. Another thing that comes to mind, listening to your discussion of alienation and the types of alienation and the degrees of alienation and the way they overlap with each other and so on, is that this is an issue that became current in critiques of Soviet-style communism, in the sense of being state capitalist. Okay, as if, and of course, this was also, this also reminds me of the kinds of comments that I mentioned first, humanist, Marxist, so to speak, and how they sometimes were interested less in political action than in a good conversation. But as if all production of all commodities all the time was inherently alienating to the degree that it had to be condemned in all of its forms. It's difficult to have industrial production of commodities, right? To have industrial production and not having it take some sort of a commodity form. In other words, even in Soviet-style economies, there was some, often largely symbolic, but nevertheless, a transfer of monetary value. Someone would purchase something that they might have made that afternoon, right? Whether it was a loaf of bread from the factory, or an automobile part if you can find one, this sort of thing, right? And it would seem that this kind of your discussion, contains enough subtlety in it that, it might be useful in addressing, what shall we say, you can be overly critical of commodity production sometimes. You can be overly critical of objectification and exteriorization sometimes, or what Marcuse referred to as kind of a necessary repression, perhaps, because it's difficult to avoid. There is something that resembles, market transfer, even in what were some of the more conservative kinds of highly centralized socialist society.
I mean, it's
Paulo César has raised
okay.
His
Yeah,
hand, and then Vesela.
I can just comment very shortly on what you mentioned there. That what I'm trying to say is that these very categorical and I would say utopian in the bad sense, utopian simple ideas about getting rid of all property, getting rid of all politics, getting rid of this, I think, is simply the wrong way to proceed. So I would go in the direction of saying, yes, some kind of commodification is probably inescapable when it comes to transfer. But the problem is that we have now a pathological dominance of the commodity category. Things that should definitely not be commodified have been commodified. So we have to strengthen the political answer to commodification. And here I actually take what I consider a genuine historical experience, namely that in the 20th century, there was a rather successful political handling of capitalism and commodification. Of course, part of the success was probably that capitalism was afraid of the communism of the Soviet regime. But still, I mean, there's something that we could learn from the 20th century of how to cope with capitalism. So that's why I talk about social democracy in this rather affirmative sense, saying that this is all that we have. We want socialism, we want democracy, so we have to work on it. And sometimes it means that we should be realistic about necessary repression, necessary alienation, the necessities of living together rather than living utopian in all by ourselves in the gardens of paradise. I mean, that is part of my way of proceeding. I don't know if it answers all your comments, but that's at least what it made me reflect on.
Paulo César, please.
I'm very thankful to. Are you able to hear me?
Yes. I've only see a picture about a mill, as it looks like maybe. Yes, person.
Yeah. So I'm very glad to hear this lecture this morning. Here in Brazil this morning, so I don't know other places. Just one comment. Humberto has raised an important point on how we can make this kind of alienation theory, more practical. And this is what I would like to ask you. When you are thinking about alienation, it looks like more kind of philosophy thing, since you cannot research it into practice. I'm facing a very hard time in trying to think of any kind of methodological approach to study alienation. So that's what I would like to ask you. What kind of methodological approach, whether quantitative, qualitative, what one of those we can raise? What kind of methodology we can raise in order to study alienation? That's something I would ask.
Yes, I mean, here I'm on shaky ground. I mean, when some of the questions that was raised by Andrew, that was what I would call around shark-filled waters. But you put me really on shaky grounds, because as a philosopher, it's not something that I have very much experience with, how to transform this. But I know that there are good people, and actually I just ran into a few of them the last few years, good sociologists that work dedicated with that makes dedicated work on empirical work on alienation. One of them is Swedish, and unfortunately his as far as I can see, very fine work is published. His doctoral dissertation is published in Swedish. But it is, and well, he combined classical methodological approaches with interview statistics and things like that, and then had the overall alienation approach. And I might say that from my perspective, his concept of alienation maybe was overly psychological, but still, he had also a comprehensive idea of alienation. But then there is a Norwegian scholar, and he actually has published a very, very good article in English in a journal recently. His name is Övers Wien. That's very difficult to, but when you can write me and I can send the link to you. And it's also a theoretical study, but he takes his point of departure not in, he argues almost the same as I do, but he does it to make precise theoretical theoretical concepts for the empirical study. So that's where he is different from my approach. And so that's one thing. And then he also takes as his reference the work of the late Marx. I take the early Marx, but he takes the late Marx. He doesn't take the capital, but he takes this work, which in German is called Grundrisse, and I'm not sure what it's called in English.
In Portuguese is Grundrisse too, and I'm pretty sure that in English is the same. Since we do not have a good translation from German to Portuguese or English to Grundrisse, that would be base of something, but that would be.
But does anybody here remember the normal translation of the Grundrisse?
I think the German title in an English translation, in an English pronunciation, is often used in English, right?
Okay.
So the foundations of Plato, whatever it was, right? So but
okay.
Yeah.
So I mean, and this Norwegian sociologist, he tries to make precise within the idea of sociological theory the concepts to be used for empirical analysis. So that's the best two references I have: a Swedish sociologist and a Norwegian sociologist. but I'm sure within this forum there might be others. But this is not one of my strongholds. I'm sorry.
If I can just add a point to what you were saying, yes, because the ones that I have studied, they stress the psychological aspects of the term alienation. For example, you can think of Moscovich or other ones, and he really stresses the support of psychological approach within social representations and alienation. So that's why I was asking, because I think this psychological approach would not be a problem if it was not to focus on individuals rather than group or social relations. And I think it's kind of very hard to think of good authors. So thank you for the recommendation. I really cannot read Swedish, but I will try to find any copy, whether it have or not, or try to translate using any kind of software. But thank you for your contribution.
But
I'm
actually,
sorry for that hard question.
No, but that's actually I'm in regular contact with these two colleagues, and I know that the Swedish scholar, he also presents his work in English. Actually, today in another Zoom session, another place in the world, he presents his work. So I mean, he has done presentations in English, probably also in writing.
What is his name?
What is his name? Let's see. I've referred to him. He has of course, a beautiful classical Swedish name, which is Johan as his first name. His name is Johan Alfonsson. Johan Alfonsson. And he made a study, or his dissertation is from Lund University in Sweden from 2020. It's called Alienation and, well, in English translation, Alienation and Work, Young Temporary Workers, the conditions of temporary young workers in flexible capitalism. Johan Alfonsson.
Brilliant.
And the Norwegian that's even more difficult. He's called Øvers Wien. I mean, this is impossible to. There's a Nordic letter like the one I have in Sørensen, and yeah. But if it's interesting, you can just write me and I can send you the link. Then it's more easy that way.
Thank you quite a lot.
Brilliant, brilliant. Vesela, you have the word. We can't hear you.
You're muted. Or at least I cannot hear. Is the problem mine, or is it
No, I think it's over there, the problem.
No, we can't hear you.
Oh,
that was some sound.
there was some sound. Could you tune up the volume?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I
Can you turn up it even more, please?
Now
Now
we
you're
can't
gone.
hear anything. Now we're gone.
No.
No sound is still.
No sound.
No, we can't hear you.
I,
I think that's a pass, Umberto.
Okay, okay. Let me see. So, if vessel account, no, okay. Do you pass the word Vesela?
Yeah.
Ah,
Oh,
What?
you said yes. If you could just speak closer to the microphone.
oh, now you're gone again.
Now you're silent again. There must be some malfunctioning with the cable or something like this. No, we can't hear you. Andrew, can you hear her?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Can you? Because I can't.
No.
Yes. You don't hear me, huh?
I can, but I don't think others can.
But maybe then you can get the question and then pose it, or
Yes.
That's fine with me.
I just wanted to ask, no, it's a very long question. It's about the social psychology, this is the social psychological aspect of alienation. This is probably the wrong position of trying to develop the micro perspective on alienation. And Goffman, for example, is one of the people who talk about the alienation of interaction. So for us, the interaction is the process of production. And when you eliminate this interaction, actually you make profit because you can, so to say, the appropriator of the product of the interaction. So as long as you participate, you cannot, so to say, see the whole of the process. But if you are alienated, actually you have a profit because you can profit from seeing the whole interaction and be the receiver of the production process. And the one example is Plato and Socrates. So there is a tradition that Plato was just the observer of an interaction, not exactly the participant. He never said anything, in this. And, so there is a different perspective on alienation here, because everybody can participate. Everybody has a language, for example. We can participate in interaction, but we also can alienate ourselves in interaction and do that this can be advantage.
Okay, let me summarize it to this point. This is a complicated question, but let's see if I can get the basic elements of it. Vessel was talking about socio-psychological aspects of alienation, in the sense that, well, she refers to Goffman as having discussed this in a certain sense. But the point is this, if you participate in interaction as an equal interaction partner, then you are not in a position to profit from that interaction in a monetary sense. However, if you step back from the interaction, if you do not participate in the actual interaction in this production, then you are in a position to personalize it, monetize it, capitalize it, and make it your own. She gives us an example from the history of philosophy, Plato and Socrates, right? Plato is known precisely for his non-participation in the interaction of Socrates with others. He describes it. He does not participate in it directly. And the fact that he has stepped back, the fact that he is in a position to observe it, puts him in a position to, in a sense, profit from it, turn it into a kind of capital that can be made a personal kind of a personal value. Is that a fair translation? Is that a fair summarization, Vesla? Yeah, she indicates it is.
Mm-hmm.
Micro perspective, the social psychological interpretation of alienation is not pathological. It's on the contrary, can be something very.
In a certain socio-psychological sense, then alienation is not pathological, because if you make it your own, you can gain a certain prestige or value from it.
And reflexivity is not possible if you don't alienate yourself from the interaction in which you.
The same is true of reflexivity. You cannot reflect. You cannot reflect upon a given interaction unless you alienate yourself from it in a certain sense.
Yeah.
Social psychological pathology is a little bit, uncomfortable for my people.
Yeah, and so sociologists actually can, if they consider psychology, if they consider alienation in the socio-psychological sense, then for them it can be something positive, because it permits reflexivity, it permits a discussion of it, abstraction from it in a certain sense.
Yeah, I think I get the idea that, but let's see if I get it. I think I because I have some discussions, especially in part 2, about how I would like to narrow down my idea of alienation, or the idea of alienation that I pursue. And that means that I also relate to other ideas of alienation. And what you mentioned is actually something, if I understand it correctly, that is often put forward, namely that some kind of distance, some kind of reflexivity, some kind of alienness is a precondition for getting knowledge or getting experience about the world in general. So, and also there is I remember especially there was some liberal philosophers in the 1980s that emphasized that that something is alien is a precondition of getting to know something. I mean, we do not know everything, so we have to know what we do not know, and especially in Danish and German, these words "fremd" it goes very easily with "Entfremdung." So I mean, in Danish and German, it's very easy to say we need to get to know what is alien, what is fremd, or what is strange. So I mean, and I relate to this in this way. I say what I do in this paper is not to try to say now I have the whole idea of alienation. Other people have done that, and they have done great work, and I benefit a lot from it. I refer to it, especially I refer to, I would call a classical work that's simply called Alienation by an American philosopher called Richard Schacht. And he published his work in 1971. So I mean, it's a great book. I benefit a lot from it. But what I do is I take this deliberately political perspective and say I want to pursue and construct an idea of alienation that can contribute to the political critique of capitalism in the direction of democracy, education, and overcoming alienation. So I mean, that's my way of delimiting myself from the general concept of alienation. And I also make one other move saying that yes, it's true that we necessarily, and especially when we talk about epistemology, there has to be something that is not ourselves, subject, object, something that we intend. But what we are talking about here, I would say, and especially if I want this critical perspective, it's about a loss. So it's a process. Alienation is a process. It's not that something is alien, but it is that something which was supposed to be familiar and homely and something that we thought of having appropriated by ourselves, that this is actually lost, that there is a process of loss, and therefore also a process of some kind of sorrow, or in the end, and I also find such connotations, you can even go to anxiety, or in the Danish-German tradition, Angst. So alienation, the pathology of alienation can include such extreme associations. And I argue actually that for Marx, this is included in his German idea of Entfremdung. And the reason I can claim that is because he got his concept of Entfremdung directly from the work of Hegel, the phenomenology of spirit. He refers to it in these manuscripts of 1844, and he refers to it with details. I mean, I'm a reader of Hegel myself, so I mean, I recognize that he is actually a reader of Hegel, Marx. So and this idea of Entfremdung in Hegel's phenomenology of spirit is actually coming from French, from the Alienation in French, where he got it from Diderot. So Hegel quotes Diderot, the Rameau's nephew, extensively in the phenomenology of spirit, and precisely the work of Diderot, where Diderot he uses the idea of alienation in the pathological anxiety sense. So therefore, I argue that the pathology, the pathological sense of alienation and Entfremdung is very important for Marx also. So there's the pathology on one side, and then there is the economy on the other side.
Excellent, excellent. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of this special session. It was a great pleasure having you, Professor Asger, with us today. We as a research committee, we are very pleased to know that there are people on the research, on the track on alienation, regardless of the approach on alienation. We believe that alienation is real, and that alienation is something that we should research, either theoretically or empirically. I would like to thank everyone for being here today, for coming. We had other two people who came, Paulo Cesar, who is a colleague of mine here at Rio de Janeiro State University. And this meeting has been recorded. I will send it over to you, and those who also want the video, the file, please let me know. And it was a great pleasure again, and thank you all for being here. And if you have your last words, please feel free to do so.
Well, I will also want to thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to reflect further on issues that we have a common interest in studying. And I believe that, just like Umberto said, that yes, alienation is real, and I'm in many on many occasions I have committed myself to what we would call in philosophy a metaphysical realism instead of an epistemological constructivism. So I mean, I also, and I believe, because I think alienation is real, I think also it's a real challenge that we confront those of us who are committed to practical issues such as politics and education. So I'm really happy that you gave me this opportunity within what I would say a really qualified public sphere to discuss these issues. So thank you very much, and thank you to you, Umberto. Thank you to Dirk, who is not here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, and see you on November 30.